Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual event, A Sustainable Path to Climate Neutrality, How Can Energy Utility Operators Contribute? My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based here in Brussels, and I'm going to be guiding us through today's conversation, coming at you live from the Euractiv studios in the heart of the EU Quarter. Now, probably most of you watching out there know that we had some big news in the energy field on Friday. The 27 prime ministers and presidents of the European Union meeting in the European Council, after 8 hours of all-night negotiations, agreed to raise the EU's 2030 climate target from a 40% emission reduction based on 1990 levels to a 55% emissions reduction based on 1990 levels. It was a hard-fought compromise. We'll go a little bit into the details of that during our discussion, but the main point is that they were finally able to agree a 2030 target that is on the trajectory to be compatible with the EU's Paris Agreement commitments and with its long-term goal of completely decarbonizing to net zero emissions by 2050. Now, this isn't as high as the European Parliament called for. They wanted a 60% reduction. The European Parliament does still have to sign off on this, but I think it's safe to assume we are going to end up with 55%, although the end language in the target could be adjusted based on what's happening next year. Essentially, on Friday morning, they agreed to put off a lot of the specifics until next year. So they agreed to look into how to use ETS revenue from the emissions trading system. They looked into how to take into account different countries' different starting points. And so next year is going to be a really key year to see how this 2030 target is implemented in actual legislation and actual obligations for national governments. Either way, this is going to be a big change. This is part of the overall transition of Europe's energy system. And decarbonizing by 2050 is a pretty big goal. It's now a goal shared by many countries in the world. The UK has also adopted a 2050 target. Joe Biden, the incoming administration in the US, has said he wants to adopt a net neutrality target for the US for 2050. So the big question is, how do all of these countries meet these goals? Now, here in Europe, we know that this is going to require a lot from Europe's energy infrastructure. The grids, the pipelines, the wires that connect us and make energy flow across the European Union. That's going to involve a lot of things. It's going to involve the grid being able to have the capacity to take on new renewables generation, especially generation that is intermittent, that is generated when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. It's also going to try to eliminate inefficiencies in the system and make sure that energy is flowing where it needs to at all times. So this is going to involve a big role for energy utility operators, because they are going to be the ones that I think a lot of this energy transformation is going to fall on in terms of delivering it. Because you could have all of the renewable generation in the world, you could have turbines and solar panels covering Europe, but if you don't have the infrastructure to actually get that energy to people's homes and businesses, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good. So today we're going to talk about how energy utility operators can brace for this change and contribute to this transformation. And we're going to be talking about both the responsibilities they have and also the assistance that can come from policymakers. So to discuss this, we have an illustrious panel here with us this morning. Let me introduce them now. First, we have Augustijn van Hasteren, a senior expert for the internal energy market at the European Commission's Energy DG. We have German Green MEP Jutta Paulus, member of the European Parliament's Environment Committee. We have Dries Akke, director of the European Climate Foundation. And we have Camilla Palladino, Executive Vice President for Corporate Strategy and Investor Relations at the Italian Energy Infrastructure, SNAM, who is the supporter of today's event. Thank you all so much for joining us today. A couple of housekeeping notes for you at home before we get started. You guys are going to have the opportunity to ask your questions to the panelists. You can do that using the Q&A feature in Vimeo that's on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm going to go ahead and start that now. So you can start asking your questions. Now I'm going to read those out to the panelists at the end of the panel. An important distinction, in there you have the chat function and the Q&A function. Feel free to use the chat function, but that is for making statements or maybe a link to something that you think might be interesting for the other viewers. Everyone will see it. The Q&A feature, only I will see it. That's where you want to put questions. So don't put questions in the chat. And don't put statements in the Q&A, because I won't read out a statement. If you have a statement, put it in the chat. Everyone can see the point that you're making. Also, if you want to join the debate on Twitter, you can using the hashtag EADebates right there below me. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me start with some introductory questions to each of our panelists. Augustijn, let me start with you. We have now the European Commission strategy for 2050. We have now also the new raised target for 2030 that's going to need implementation in legislation next year. So how do energy utilities factor in the Commission's strategy here? What are they going to need to do to meet these targets?
So let me first say that indeed we're living in very exciting times. I think with all the new Commission has started off with the clear ambition to make, let's say, our green economy a reality, and has done lots of preparatory work in order to set the horizon against which the institution has to react to these ambitions. So I mean, there was already the commitment on net zero by 2050. There's now a commitment in the Council of 55%, and that actually sets the stage for the work program of the Commission next year, because of course these agreements, they reflect a consensus as to where we want to land in 2030 and 2050. It's an ambition, but it's also the ambition of the Commission to make this ambition a reality, and I think that is very much in the pipeline for next year. So we will see a flurry of initiatives of the Commission to make this kind of ambition concrete and make it happen. So around June next year, we are expecting working towards a large package which looks very much at how we're going to achieve this 55 target by 2030, so that we indeed remain on the path to 2050. So that will relate to things which incentivize decarbonisation, such as TTS, the Renewables Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive. There will also be a look to energy taxation, which is for the moment not really guided towards actually making sure that we use the energy sources which are most effective in the decarbonisation pathway. And what I think will also change is, whereas in the past the work was very much guided towards the greening of electricity production, I think next year we'll also see a more serious attempt to also decarbonize other energy carriers, and I'm thinking primarily about gaseous fuels, where things will also need to move in order to stay on the pathway to net zero by 2050. Of course, it doesn't mean that, and that what it really will do, it will set the framework in which the private sector, the utilities have to operate in the next future. So it's a bit difficult at this stage to describe in detail what this framework will look like, because evidently this will depend on the proposals and the negotiations in the council. But it is quite clear that these changes will lead to significant changes in the environment in which utilities have to operate. I think if you ask me for a vision of what this energy system will look like, I think it's best to refer to the energy system integration strategy, which the Commission already published in July next year, where although that is a movement has but to some extent already started, there's really strong emphasis on the need to make the energy system more integrated, and where we move away from the system where we have a one-way street for the energy producer to the energy consumer, where the system will become much more integrated and we reduce losses and inefficiencies, and where the energy flows between users and producers will become much more let's say bi-directional. Evidently, this will change the environment, but I think we will continue to need, and we will the utilities, because evidently this movement will require lots of investments, and even if public funds will be made available in generous amounts, of course, the majority of the investments will remain to be privately financed, and utilities play, of course, a very important role in that. The role of utilities will, I think, we will see this becoming more clear over next year. What is clear, though, is that this new framework on which utilities have to act will provide for plenty of opportunities, and for also for continuing market functioning to play a role in that context. I'll leave it here for the moment.
Thanks a lot, Augustin. Let's turn next now to Jutta. As I mentioned, the 2030 target agreed isn't as high as the Parliament wanted. So as we're looking forward and the Parliament is consulting on all of these strategies and also the implementing legislation that's going to come next year, how do you assess whether the EU strategy is taking into account the realities and needs of the current energy system? Do you think we're on the right track?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this important debate. And I want to point out that what the heads of state agreed upon is not 55%, but at least 55%. So that still gives some space for the negotiations at the trilogues, because Parliament's position to say 60% and not net 60% is quite a bit away from at least 55 net emission reduction. But when it comes to the actual legislation, of course, there will be a lot of attention to the ETS revision, to the effort sharing revision, to the Renewable Energy Directive, but still we have to take into account that there are other very important legislative proposals when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. For example, we will be talking about the methane fugitive emissions that have to be tackled urgently. The Commission has announced that there will be a legislative proposal on leak detection and reparation. In the energy sector, we will see the revision of the ozone layer protection directive, which also affects, of course, greenhouse gas emissions, because most gases that deplete the ozone layer have also a very strong greenhouse gas potential. So there will be some feedback there. And I think what we really have to see is that not just transforming the way that we generate electricity or that we use energy, but that we have to really integrate all sectors together. And right now, many member states have quite a few obstacles to this integration. For example, in my home country, Germany, we have a lot of tax and levies on the electricity sectors, which actually hinder the decarbonization of the heating sector, because at the end of the day, it is much cheaper to heat your home using gas instead of electricity. But as we know, electricity can be decarbonized quite easily as compared to gas. And we will have to have a very close look on the implementation of the hydrogen strategy, because hydrogen is a very valuable energy carrier, but we must make sure that it is used in those sectors that cannot be decarbonized in any other way. Speaking, of course, of chemistry, steel, aviation, and maritime transport. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jutta. Dries, let's turn to you next. How important is, you guys are really looking at these issues from a big umbrella perspective. How important is a well-integrated energy distribution system and the infrastructure? How important is that going to be in meeting the EU's climate goals?
Yes, thank you, Dave, and thank you to Euractiv for the invitation. Let me first pick up on your introduction and reinforce the fact that we are indeed seeing, at the end of 2020, quite a special year, an enormous comeback of momentum around climate action. The 55% and the net zero objectives of the European Union also have an impact internationally. So I think it's quite good to see how Europe's ambition is diplomatically yielding results internationally towards China, hopefully the US, some other Asian players around net zero. So the stars are really aligning quite well towards COP26 for a starting gun in terms of having the race towards the low carbon, zero carbon transition being on. So this is the time to make it a reality and to get on with the job to implement those targets. To your question, yes, the energy system integration is of course essential. Just look at all of the net zero 2050 scenarios that are out there. You can clearly see what are the main drivers of this action, and that lies primarily with electrification. That is going to be the main driver of the energy system integration and also of carbon abatement. And I would argue that there's another mega trend in society, digitization, that is mutually reinforcing the electrification, and there's an enormous innovation and uptake around those two mega trends in society that are very mutually beneficial. It will impact all the parts of the economy, buildings, transport, industry, and it will lead to more comfort, less polluting cities, noise pollution as well, more modern and efficient industry. So this is really the thing to get right. My plea would be towards policymakers to make sure that getting electrification right, clean and smart is really the thing that deserves most attention and headspace from our decision makers. There's other parts of the energy system integration as well, relating to, for example, power to X or CHP, but these are comparatively smaller niche solutions. I think it's important to make that difference and to know what policymakers need to focus on first, which is clean electrification and renewables build out. Those are the most important drivers. When it comes to the role of gas, it's actually interesting to see what 55%, or as Mrs. Powell says, at least 55%, and the net zero 2050 objectives actually mean for gas. It will mean a steep decline, and not in the long term, like in the short term as well. If you look at the numbers, 55% in 2030 means a reduction of 30% of fossil gas use across the European economy, as well as a minus 15% of fossil gas imports. So that as well declines. So I would say it's not a golden age for gas. Remember, that's IEA expression. It's rather a declining age for gas in the short term and towards full phase out by 2050. So by all means, I'm actually very interested in the next presentation from the lady of SNAM to understand how their business models are going to adapt to this new reality that is at the doorstep. Thank you.
Indeed, Camilla, we're very eager to hear from you because, of course, you are really coming at from the perspective of the people who have to make this change, right? So how would you say energy utility operators can contribute to the EU's 2030 and 2050 goals?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Euractiv. So I think we work on net zero in two main ways. We work on net zero in our own operations. We have a net zero by 2040 target on our scopes 1 and 2, and a minus 50% emissions reduction target by 2030. That means obviously, the big sources of scope 1 and 2 emissions for us are, the major part of it is the emissions from the compressor stations, from our own energy use, and methane emissions. And on both of those, we have programs to electrify the compressor stations, reducing emissions that way. And in terms of methane leakage, we have a leak detection and remediation campaign that's started, and that is already yielding results and will result in a further and rapid fall in emissions. And then the second piece, I think, is the way we work to help decarbonize the system overall. We think green gases, renewable gases, will be a relatively sizable part of the energy mix, or the fully decarbonized energy mix, something in the region of 25%. So, we agree with everything that's been said on the importance of electrification, which is going to rise significantly as a percentage of consumption, and of course the build out of renewables to fuel that, as it were. And then you're left with the sectors that cannot be electrified, which are important parts of our economies, and with some, I suppose, some areas like peak winter heating, where I think the debate is still out on what the optimal solution will be from a technical and economic standpoint, and whether we'll be looking at just one solutions or hybrid solutions, where the absolute peak could be maybe biomethane, a green molecule of some sort. But in any case, I think there's broad agreement on the shape of the 2050 fully decarbonized system. And I think that the grid, the existing gas infrastructure, is fundamental for this to happen. On the one hand, because it's the most efficient way of delivering green gases, right? So, to have your cheapest possible so the grid is essential to deliver this hydrogen. We also think that it's important to start up the green gas. We think the grid is important to start up the green gas, I suppose, growth trajectory, because obviously we need to get to something like 25% by 2050, and I think we need to start soon and to have a sizable proportion of green gases as part of the mix by 2030, so that everybody who has an investment cycle where they need to reinvest, industries that need to reinvest in their operations, they can already seize the green hydrogen opportunity. So in that sense, we think that the grid, in the fact that it already exists and that investments required to repurpose it are very limited, can play a key role. We're very active on that. So we are running a process to make our infrastructure hydrogen ready, which means that everything we buy from now in terms of pipes is according to a hydrogen-ready standard as a sort of a free option, as it were. And we're doing a hydrogen audit, I suppose, on everything that we have underground, all of the pipes, to see what percentage would already be ready to have hydrogen in them, and what changes would need to be made to the others. And it looks so far that 70% of the pipelines that are underground are already hydrogen ready in terms of material. So again, that's very useful and points to the fact that the investments required would be small. We're also working with all of our peers in Europe to build a sort of a common vision, common standards, share technical knowledge, and to make sure that what we can deliver is agreed. Because one of the things that we're going to need as a continent as we move to full decarbonisation and full renewables is to be able to move energy around the continent safely, cheaply, to ensure that we don't lose in terms of supply security. And the fact of being able to interconnect the different existing infrastructures is key to that. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Augustine, let me put some of those points to you that Camilla just raised about both the needs for delivery from the energy utility side, but also what's needed in terms of the overall framework. From the Commission's perspective, what updates are needed to the EU's energy infrastructure to deliver on these targets specifically? And also, when we're talking about infrastructure planning, it's a big process. It's done many years in advance. So what changes are going to be needed to the planning in particular in order to meet these targets?
I think, first of all, one thing to emphasize is that we see already, but we will see increasingly that our energy systems are becoming more interdependent. And whereas in the past, network planning was conducted very much in silos, gas network, electricity network, we will have to move to a world where where the options for investments are really assessed in a more integrated basis, and where we enter into an era of more holistic network planning. This is to some extent already happening, but probably it needs an additional push in order to really make sure that we have the network planning which is required for a 2050 kind of world. Another element is that it's clear that if we want to support and increase the level of electrification, we will have to put a lot of emphasis in investments in the electricity grid. That is to connect new sources, including sources which we cannot reach for the moment, offshore, for instance. And we have recently also produced an offshore strategy to project our vision as to how this should develop. But also on the gaseous fuel side. Let me first say that it's also in our vision very clear that indeed we need to emphasize electrification. But for those sectors where electrification is not possible or not realistic, also in economic terms, we need to see continued use of gaseous fuels. I fully agree with one of the previous speakers that the role of natural gas in that context will have to decrease quite dramatically, because if we want to continue using gaseous fuels, it's very clear that these has to be decarbonized gaseous fuels. In our projections as to what the world would look like when it comes to gaseous fuels by 2050, we will see still a quite substantial use of gaseous fuels. However, even if it is substantial, even not so far actually from the amount of energy we carry by gaseous fuels today, the world will certainly not look like we know it today, because the composition of gaseous fuels will radically change. So that means more biomethane. It means either from agricultural waste or from waste dumps and so on. And maybe in the longer future also more synthetically produced methane. But in parallel thereof, it's also quite clear that in certain sectors, and I'm referring in particular to industry and transportation, certain elements of transportation at least, we will also see an increased use of hydrogen, and this hydrogen will need to be transported in infrastructure which is independent of the current methane infrastructure. And this is something we will also be looking into next year, because I think in our idea it's quite clear that the most cost-efficient way of rolling out this parallel infrastructure is by increasingly using the methane infrastructure, which will become available even when the natural gas is being reduced in consumption. So we will need to, and also this, of course, we need to plan in a more holistic fashion. So when I speak about holistic network planning, maybe we should consider not just looking more intensively to the gas and electricity sector, work which has already started at least, but we should also look at it in the context of new infrastructure which is needed, both because it's connected to the methane infrastructure from which it will be repurposed, but also because there are very clearly strong interdependencies between, at one end, hydrogen and in particular also the electricity sector, where, for instance, I'm just mentioning it as an example, but if we make sure that electrolyzers are, for instance, placed in the right location, we can actually reduce the amount of congestion which will they may create in the LT network quite substantially, and reduce the building of the need to build more electricity infrastructure, for instance. Maybe I'll stop here for the moment, but it's quite clear that some new ideas and new spades in the ground will be necessary.
Sense. When we're thinking about those interdependencies that you mentioned, Dries, let me put this question to you. When we're looking at the energy infrastructure needs, and again, as I mentioned, how far ahead that planning needs to come, do you think that the EU policy in place right now is up to the challenge of spurring all of that investment and updating?
Yes, thanks for that question. So, no, the answer is no. I think we're all looking forward to the Commission press statement later today on the new 10E infrastructure regulation legislative proposal. What we hear, of course, is that it's going to be quite disappointing, and I think I'm afraid I have to be quite clear on that. The points that Augustijn was making in terms of improved scenario planning, cross-infrastructural thinking is absolutely correct. But the Commission is not following up on that conclusion and is actually continuing with a decision-making structure which continues to put the TSOs, both on the gas and the electricity side, in the leading seat to define the infrastructure priorities for the European Union as a whole and for taxpayers' money to go into. And this is quite a critical element of the story. And this is not me just saying that. This is the European Ombudsman saying that. It's the European Court of Auditors. For some reason, the Commission has dismissed some of those criticisms and thinks it can continue with what we consider to be a very clearly skewed government system that is lacking both checks and balances as well as independence for such an important task. Because of course, we will have to be smarter about what are the real priorities. Yeah, how much hydrogen pipelines do we actually need? You cannot ask that question to Snam through the NSOG construction. That is just obviously wrong, but that is a system. And also in the revision, that unless something happened since the last draft, that the Commission is looking at. So I'm afraid to say this is not the last time we talk about it, and I'm hoping that within the European Parliament, in the co-decision process, we can rectify some of these obvious problems. Thank you.
So Camilla, let me put that point to you, because indeed NSOG's role, just so people at home who don't know what it is, so it's a group of energy utility operators that advise the Commission on infrastructure investment. And its role is controversial because some people say that the utility operators themselves shouldn't be the ones deciding where the money goes, essentially. Camilla, let me put that point to you. When you are looking at this long-term planning that's going to be necessary for the energy transition, Is it important that utilities themselves are listened to about where the needs are? But at the same time, is there a risk that, of course, utilities are always going to push the investment where they would like it to go, maybe not necessarily where it should go?
So I think one of the key things to have an efficient infrastructure planning planning system is both to have very solid scenarios. So I think we need to agree on what, or to have, like, obviously the scenarios are not forecasts, but you need to try and understand what is likely to happen, and that already gives you a shared view of what any potential decisions are based on. And I think the growing interdependence between TSOs, gas and electricity TSOs, is also another way of thinking about this, because in a way what we're talking about is an energy system that needs to transform, and this energy system transformation will require obviously full decarbonisation and a big growth in renewable production and a big growth in electrification, and I suppose you would want to solve all of the challenges that come from that in the best way possible for the system. And so I'm in full agreement as to the importance of coordinated planning between the different TSOs, the electricity and the gas side, so as to solve for the issue, for the energy issue, rather than to go ahead as they have done in the past, with just sort of an electricity view and then a gas view, and you would only solve for your part of the energy system. And this, I think, to increase efficiency by solving for the full energy system and coordinating with the different parts.
Interesting point, Jutta. Let me put that to you. Dries mentioned that he'd like to see the Parliament take a stronger role here. What's your view on the proper role of the utilities themselves, the infrastructure operators themselves, in deciding where this investment is needed?
I think we should differentiate between utilities, meaning electricity production, for example, and grid operators. I believe in most countries, grid operators have a natural monopoly. I am not sure whether this is the correct English translation, but there will be no one building a second gas grid, for example. And for this reason, the profits are regulated, usually are regulated on a legislative base. But if the grid operators themselves decide how much grid do we need, then they themselves decide on their profits. So I think it's very important to have a broader view here, to involve a lot of stakeholders. And having seen a glimpse of the leak of the 10E guidelines, which will be published today, I was a bit concerned that the sustainability criteria, which we as Parliament wanted to have in there, and which also the European Ombudswoman called for after a complaint from Food and Water, they are rather weak. They are not concrete. So just to say, well, this project will save CO2 emissions, sorry, for me, this is not enough. We have to know what is actually the amount of emissions that's being saved by a certain investment, because we don't have unlimited access to money, and we should spend it wisely. So basically what I'm calling for is a more thorough scrutinization by other experts. Also, we have called for a stronger role for ACER, which is the European agency of regulators, where the national regulators work together, trying to assess the scenarios which the grid operators have been presenting. And I think that ACER should play a much stronger role there, but of course they would have to be equipped with the adequate resources for that. Thank you.
Augustine, let me get you to respond to that point. How would you respond to that criticism?
First of all, I think a debate on the
Augustine, I think your mic might be. You're okay. You're okay.
Okay. First of all, I think a debate around the governance of network planning is not unjustified, let me put it this way, because if we want to have integrated network planning, of course, we also have to move it beyond the remit of an individual TSO. I thought I needed to react briefly to this because even if one can have a debate on the governance structure and whether it's sufficient on the network planning side, I think it's also fair to add that, of course, TSOs do not decide by themselves what kind of investments they're going to be making. The investment plans, they are basically the basis for approval of their regulated investments, which they can do as a TSO, and it is only those on which they are remunerated by the tariffs. And that means, of course, there is already a governance structure. So I thought I needed to correct a little bit this image that TSOs fully decide by themselves. I would say it a bit like that. And to how exactly this governance structure then needs to look at, we will learn more about it tomorrow. And I'm sure that this debate will continue in the council and as to whom will be involved, and by the parliament, of course, to whom will be involved and in what way. Thank you.
Thanks, Augustine. Let's move on to a different topic. Let's talk about the other legislative frameworks that will need to be revised to meet this target, both these targets, the 2030 and the 2050 targets. Dries, let me go to you first. When we're thinking about other EU energy policy frameworks, other than the ones we've talked about so far, what do you think needs to be revised to make sure that the EU's energy infrastructure is ready for this transformation?
Yes, thank you. There are indeed the obvious ones that we already touched on. A new target means a strengthening of the ETS and a revision of the ESR. It also means bringing the Renewable Energy Directive and the Efficiency Directive in line with those new targets. So I think all of those things are relatively straightforward, if I dare to say. Not at all, of course, but you know what I mean. The one piece of legislation I wanted to pick up on, and Mr. Van Halsteren already mentioned it, is the energy taxation side of things. We know the European Commission and it doesn't have exclusive competencies on that, but opening a conversation with member states around energy taxation is going to be very useful. Giving transparency, looking at level playing fields, thinking about the alignment with the Green Deal and with the climate targets, that's, I think, really overdue. What we know is that there's quite a significant amount of hidden subsidies going to fossil fuels through energy taxation lags or practices. I've been looking at a report from Bruegel, this economic think tank that I'm sure you know. They've looked at all those hidden fossil fuel taxes around taxation, and they come to, for Italy, a number of 7 billion euro per year of indirect hidden fossil fuel subsidies for the gas industry. So I'm sure SNAM is happy with that because they can sponsor your active events. But jokes apart, I think it's time to look at that, to align that with the Green Deal as well. Thank you.
Camilla, let me go to you. What do you think, when we're looking at all the different legislative frameworks, what do you think needs updating in order to get Europe's infrastructure ready for the transformation?
So in terms of the taxation that we were talking about before, and that Dries were talking, just to highlight, I think that it's very important that a level playing field is created, and that Europe proceeds in the most efficient way possible to full decarbonisation. And we're strong believers in the fact that green gases and the development of green gases is a saving for Europe compared to full decarbonisation. We ran a study with the Gas for Climate Consortium a while back now, a couple of years ago, that basically looked at a fully electrified system, sort of a no gas or minimal gas scenario, and then a optimal gas scenario, which according to the modelling was where you saved money from having green gases. And there was a saving, I think, of 200 billion euros a year from 2050 from having gas in the model compared to having to electrify everything. So we're keen for the process, whatever let me try and put it this way. We're keen for whatever the rules and the governance of the process is to be fair, so that these savings emerge, if that makes sense. So, that will presumably mean different sorts of cost-benefit analysis, aiming to show how alternative investments compete for the same need. There's going to be a whole lot of things that we need to do, but I think the broad ambition is shared and clear.
Jutta, let me put that question to you as well. When you're looking at all the different legislative frameworks, what do you think needs updating?
To work. Well, of course, we will be looking at the Energy Tax Directive, but I am quite reluctant whether this will succeed, because taxation is an unanimity issue. So if we have just one member state in council blocking a revised directive, we'll be back to square one, which has happened in the past already. So in my view, we should really look at the sustainability criteria in the 10E guideline, so that we have at least the possibility to influence those priority projects which will be fostered through the 10E regulation. And secondly, I think what we should aim for is actually putting very strict directives in the effort sharing regulation, because we will have to make sure that member states do not only improve the climate targets when it comes to the ETS, which is in most of the cases fairly easy, but also in the effort sharing. And there we can really have a push for the sector integration. In most member states, the emissions from the transport have not decreased since the 90s, but this is a sector which will need rapid improvement. So there we should make a real push for sector integration, for example, with quotas, with targets, also with new emission ceilings for new vehicles. But we will see how this will all play out in the strategy for sustainable and smart mobility, which the Commission just put out, I think it was last week. There was a, not so ambitious target for electromobility. And I think that we should make sure that we ramp up the benefits of electrification in that sector too. Thanks.
So Augustine, let me put all of those points to you. Obviously, the Commission is the one who's going to be putting these proposals forward. And also, if you could specifically address Jutta's point about taxation and how the treaty limitations might be overcome there.
Let me start with the other thing. I think with the last thing, when it comes to taxation, I think one doesn't need to look very long to the figures and the situation around that. When it comes to taxation, we really need to change something. The costs which we pile on electricity bills relative to the cost we put on other energy carriers bills is not inducive to stimulate the increasing electrification which we need in order to get to the 2050. I think if my counting is correct, this will become the 4th time that the Commission will bring the revision of the taxation directive, energy taxation directive, to the agenda. So I'm not going to pretend that it's going to be easy, and even if economic rational demands that something needs to be done in this area, economic rational arguments tend to not to have much weight on the moment. Other issues like the independence of member states is at stake. Anyway, we should try, and I think around this issue there's an increasing consensus that indeed we should not just try but also achieve something. And then of course it's not so that whereas this ambition as the Commission is there and we want to of course work into that direction, of course there are plenty of other arguments instruments where we can make an impact. And many of those are also on the agenda of the next year's Commission. I mentioned already RED, energy efficiency. There is also work around CO2 emissions for cars. There is lots of work around making funds available. There's a revision of the mobility fuels. I mentioned already elements related to the enabling of a decarbonisation of gas, and on a whole list. It's actually a rather, I would say personally, well, because I'm part of the people who actually have to do it, very ambitious agenda. And even if we cannot institutionally, we are hindered in making progress in one area. Of course, we should also try to do this by other instruments where this is more easier and where we can use more established instruments. I hope that provides some clarity.
Makes sense. I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Just a reminder, you guys can ask your questions to the panelists at home using the Q&A feature, the little question mark button to the right of your screen on Vimeo. But first I wanted to ask a question I was curious about. I mean, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the reason we're all speaking here remotely rather than being together in person. Camilla, I was wondering, has the pandemic affected the operations for energy utility operators, the changed habits we all have now in the way we consume energy? Have energy utility operators noticed a big difference? And do you think that's going to make any impact on how we're preparing to meet these targets, or is it really just going to be kind of a temporary blip?
So, for us, from our perspective, what we saw was obviously a change in our own operations. In the pandemic, we have the dispatching center in Italy, which ensures that gas gets everywhere, and it's an essential service. So during the pandemic, we had very strong security measures for the people who are operating this essential infrastructure. So there's been a lot of safety and contingency planning on the actual operations. In terms of energy use, there's clearly been a strong decline in energy use. And when we look at the bounce back, when we look at how energy use will come back, it's obviously going to increase again as the pandemic hopefully is overcome, and already in the moments when we had lighter or no lockdowns, you could see the bounce. And there's presumably going to be some habits that are forever changed or changed for the very long term, in terms of maybe travel, in terms of smart working, so there's going to be, I think, some long-term modification in energy use. But obviously, we will see a recovery from where it's been, where it's been over the course of the year. And then, if I could echo, I think Dries said so earlier on, but there's definitely lots and lots of momentum that's happened also in this year behind decarbonisation and climate change, and I think that's very good news. I think the fact that we've taken this opportunity to reflect on also how to rebuild and how to use how to best leverage this time to move forward on our long-term goals, I think is very good news.
Augustin, let me put the same question to you. How does the Commission assess the change in energy consumption and energy distribution? And do you think that the effects of the COVID-19 crisis, purely from an energy usage perspective, are going to affect the EU's long-term planning for infrastructure to meet these targets?
That's an interesting question, but it's very difficult to find an intelligent answer to this at this moment in time. What is clear, though, is that the current situation is a moment where habits can change. Habits often change. I only look to myself. If you have a necessity to do this, and once you're in a situation where it is necessary, actually make the choices which you should have taken maybe some time ago. And so it is a moment where more structural reflection can take place as to what our future habits will be and what our consumption patterns as a result also will be. And this is not unimportant, and maybe once the dust settles, we should try to learn some lessons from this. Although this has not maybe gotten the attention which it should have had, but I recall that in our impact assessment, not the climate plan impact assessment, but the one which was elaborated in order to in preparation to the Katowice climate conference. There were also scenarios which related to not so much structural change in the energy sector, but structural changes in the habits of people, which had certainly a significant impact in our energy consumption, and related to that, of course, emissions. So we should not stop thinking about making this kind of changes as well.
Dries, I wonder if you have a thought on this in terms of what the lessons are to be learned about the change in patterns during this crisis.
Yes, thank you. The way we see it is that it's some kind of a postcard from the future. Yeah, and with that I mean that what we've seen is that solar and winds in the electricity system has been performing in a very resilient way, in a very trustworthy way. So we've been confronted with electricity systems with 50+% solar and wind in there. And what we've noticed, at least as far as I know, the lights didn't go out. So that's good news, but we need to work on some elements like negative prices. And so there were some important lessons. Now, I do think that the most important lesson and shift that we've seen this year in the energy sector is actually that if you look at the stock markets and you look at energy companies, just take some time to absorb this factoid. Yeah? The company Ørsted, a former oil and gas company, now fully committed to renewables, is worth more than any BP and Equinor, just in 1 year. The energy giants of the future are going to be renewable energy giants. There's no doubt about it. Now, there's one more thing. I just wanted to come back very quickly to the comments from the colleague from SNAM, or the person from SNAM, about the importance of green gases. Obviously, I don't think anybody who is serious in this space is arguing for full electrification of the entire economy. That's not possible, we know that. But it's about specific use of the green gases where they add value. And I just wanted to kind of ask you, out of genuine interest, whether SNAM is understanding this difference. Because what we see is that SNAM is about to invest, or is pushing to invest, in a whole new gas distribution network in Sardinia in Italy for heating homes on a relatively warm island, to bring people into fossil gas at this point. This is not going to be hydrogen compatible in any way. You will be confronted with expensive hydrogen that the industry and the aviation sector wants to pay for, and that you're going to ask people to pay a higher price for something that you can perfectly do without heating homes, without green gases as well. So why is SNAM investing in this whole new Sardinia gas distribution network in 2020?
Camilla, do you have a response to Dries's question?
To be a little bit more broad in terms of Dries's question, I think we do understand that everything that we do needs to be future-proof, and it's obviously a situation where you have to balance out, a pathway that gets you to something that is, 100% decarbonized and future-proof. And what you need to do, I think, is both do the things that you need now and make sure that whatever you've done is useful and is what's hopefully useful, right? Because we don't fully know what's going to happen. It's not completely deterministic, but we're looking to no regrets options and no regrets investments, and it's one of the reasons why everything we do is hydrogen ready already. And in terms of the sectors that we're talking about, I agree with you. I think that hydrogen use, that it clearly shouldn't be fully electrified, and hydrogen should be used where it adds value, or to put it another way, where either electrification is not possible, or where it's more expensive. And we're looking at trying to figure out what the ideal mix looks like, and that's going to be something that's that will depend on all of the different costs that you need to have to adapt our economies and our infrastructure and our use cases when we have to switch different vectors. So I think it'll be a combination of the two, and exactly what shape this combination will take, we don't know yet. We're all thinking about it. We're thinking about it together with the electricity TSOs, and we're thinking about it, I think, as a continent. Everybody's trying to figure it out, and you need to try and balance. You need to try and figure out what needs to happen now and what needs to happen in the future, and what the best way forward is.
Well, let's take some questions from the audience now. We have a first question from an anonymous questioner. It's for you, Camilla. What type of hydrogen is suitable for the 70% underground pipes that you mentioned? So what type of hydrogen can go in those underground pipes that you were talking about earlier?
I'm not sure what the question is asking exactly. It's hydrogen as a molecule, right? It doesn't matter what it's made of, if you see what I mean. This is a sort of a technical point about the H2 molecule, and if you look at what different types of hydrogen, renewable hydrogen and low carbon hydrogen can be made, they all fit into the pipeline equally.
Okay, let's take another question here, another anonymous question. Let me put this to Jutta. So the questioner asks, consumers will pay the price of all this carbon neutrality. How do you secure a fair playing ground for all? I think this is definitely referring to some of the concerns that kept negotiators up all night on overnight Thursday to agree this 2030 target, and that is that different countries and different regions are starting from different starting points, different GDP. How do you make sure that this transition is fair to everybody, taking into consideration everybody's different starting points? And how do you make sure, well, will consumers have to pay the cost for this transition? And if they do, how can you convince them to do so, Jutta?
Well, what I would like to do is to put things into perspective first, because the cost for consumers, I don't like this word anyway, the cost for people will be much, much higher if we do not combat climate change. We have seen a glimpse of it in the last summers of 2018 and 2019, where we had the biggest pressure actually on those people that live in areas where there is no adequate possibility to keep your house cool, for example. We had devastating numbers of older people dying from heat stress. So basically, decarbonization is also an issue to address exactly these social differences. I mean, it's fortunately in Europe we don't have the same situation as in California. I don't know whether any of you read this very disturbing article that the rich people could afford a private fire emergency brigade at their homes, whereas the poorer communities lost everything. So basically, decarbonization is a social issue in itself. But of course, you're very right. We have to make sure that the cost will be fairly distributed. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you might see it as you wish, taxation of income is the member states' reposit. So the European Union cannot do anything there. But what we are doing actually is that with the Just Transition Fund, especially those communities that are affected most by the transition to non-fossil energy sources will receive support on their pathway. There are good examples already, especially those where all stakeholders have their say, so that solutions will be developed together with people and not top down. So this is very important to ensure acceptance, but we also have to make sure that we do not, well, to put some things in perspective, again, we had Inger Anderson, the chief of the UN Environment Program, in our environmental committee last week, and she showed this slide that 7% of the world's population, which is those earning above 100,000 euros a year, are responsible for more emissions than the bottom half of people. so we have 1%, sorry, 1% of the population are responsible for 15% of the emissions, whereas the lower 50% of the world population just cause 7% of emissions. So we have to make sure that we curb those emissions which are, I'd say, luxury emissions. There must not be the effect that people will have to choose between heating and eating. And I hope that we can make sure that, for example, also in the ETS directive, all money that comes in through carbon revenues will go into decarbonisation, and there will be directed to the poorest, to the most affected, so that we can avoid energy poverty. And I'm very glad that the Commission has taken this up already in the Renovation Wave strategy, where this issue of energy poverty, of the possibility to keep your house warm or cool according to your needs, is addressed in a separate chapter. And thank you very much to the Commission for taking this up, because it's really a very important issue. Thanks.
Camilla, what are your thoughts on how to make this transition fair?
So I think there's two questions right there. One is the question of how to make it, the way you make it fair, I think, is you make it as cheap as possible, the transition itself, and then you try and distribute the costs as fairly as possible. So I think from our side, we're a company, so our interest is to try and make sure that the transition is as cheap as possible, as efficient as possible for people, as you were saying, and that that we need to balance, the need for affordability. Rather than balance, we need to consider the need for affordability in everything that we do. So I think it's important not just that we get to zero, which is very, very important, but that we get there in the right way, and with the least possible expense. And to go back to the way that we think about it, we just underline, we are convinced that the role of green gas, where they add value, where they reduce cost, is very important for the system, and it's very important for this to develop at the right time, in the scale and in the correct sectors, as they happen. And there will be some sectors where electrification is impossible or more expensive than green gases. And what we're looking for and what we're trying to understand is what processes and systems and tools allow this system to emerge in the best way possible.
Well, let's take, we have 3 questions here for Augustine. So I'm going to ask you, I know you might not be able to answer these, but we've been talking about future policies and people want to know timelines and dates. So Anna Hubert asks you, Augustine, do you have a date for the second trilogue on the climate law? Then Gustav asks, is the holistic approach, in the holistic approach, what is the calendar for revision of the Renewable Energy Directive 2? Let me ask you those 2 timeline questions first. Do you have any kind of dates for those?
And for the second trilogue in the climate law, because I simply don't know. As it comes to holistic network planning, I think elements of this idea will already come in the very soon to be released 10E regulation. But that will probably more relate to some governance elements, and also the governance of the, let's say, the selection of the PCIs and so on. Whereas some thinking may still need to be necessary, whether and to what extent it's necessary to reflect this approach also in the network development plans, which are customarily elaborated on national level. And that is more likely to be addressed, I think, in the package which relate to the gas decarbonisation plans. And I say that only because the instruments which are affected by that are, apart from the 10E, also the gas and electricity regulatory framework, and it is at that moment in time that those instruments are being reopened. So, but if the specific question is when the proposal will be adopted by current understanding, for the RED II revision, that is in June, whereas the let's say the rules around gas networks and gas decarbonization are more likely to come in Q4 next year.
But one more specific question to you. This is not your DG, so I have a feeling you won't be able to answer, but I'll put it to you anyway. This is from Juliette Delarue. Is DG Comp ready not to approve aid support to fossil gas infrastructure when there are no regret alternatives? Could you shine any light on that?
Maybe I should say that I hope at least that we'll be able to do it. I'll say it a bit like that. I cannot really give a very concrete answer to this.
It's a good diplomatic answer between DGs. Great. So thanks to all the panelists for some great interventions. Now I'd like to get your concluding thoughts on the topic. Let's go backwards this time. So let's start with Camilla. Camilla, what are your key takeaways from today's conversation?
I think it's been a very interesting conversation, and I think I understand the different points of view and the point of convergence, I suppose, between different starting points. I think there's remarkable convergence on the objective, on what we're trying to achieve here, and I think that it's going to be important for all of the stakeholders, to be working together with this concrete objective in mind of an efficient and a rational and a fair decarbonisation to 2050.
Dries, what are your concluding thoughts today?
Thank you, Dave. I agree. It was an interesting conversation, so thanks for that. My concluding thoughts are that the Green Deal is for everybody. And I think that's an important element of it. We're all in this together, from companies to civil society, to citizens, to policymakers. This is the framing that we all need to adopt and look at our role within that context going forward. So what I take away is that there's still many companies like Snam who, I take it's not easy, but are not internalizing what net zero and the 2030 targets mean and what Green Deal means. And they are still in the business of greenwashing, spinning. For example, the emission reporting from Snam that I did recently is only scope 1 and scope 2. It's a bit technical, but it basically means that Snam does not take any responsibility for what goes through their pipelines. So that is something that just becomes unacceptable and is countering the spirit of the Green Deal and soon the legislation as well. So I think it's time to change. Let's get serious. Thank you.
Camilla, I just want to go back to, do you want to respond to that point?
Just really quickly, if you could, the net zero target that we have given is scope 1 and 2, and we think that our role is very important to enable the green gases to flow through our network. So I did mention this before, but we're very committed to ensuring that to doing our part, to make it possible and to make it possible for people to flow green gases through our network. So that's we agree that this is part of our role in the system and how we should, and that making the network hydrogen ready and making it as simple as possible for green gases to flow through the network is important.
Jutta, what are your key takeaways from today's discussion?
Well, my key takeaway is actually that I'm very glad to hear the other speakers' statements, especially when it comes to the coordination between the two networks, between the molecules network and the electricity network, because I think we have been thinking in silos there much too long, and to have a proper sector integration to actually be able to achieve those climate targets which we have set ourselves, which are even not sufficient from a scientific point of view, because climate scientists told us, well, 65% would be the correct number to aim for if we want to keep on the 1.5 track. So this was also what we Greens tried to achieve, but unfortunately it wasn't possible to have a majority for that. But to come back to the issue, we need proper integration, we need holistic thinking there, and we should think from the target. We should think from where do we want to go, and then have a downward declination, so to speak. What do we have to do today? What is the planning that has to be done as fast as possible? And one other example, for example, which we haven't spoken about today, but we read the offshore strategy from the European Commission, and the target, which is set for 2030, would mean that we need planning, maritime spatial planning, in the next 3 years in order to be able to achieve our targets 2030. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to sector integration. So I'm very glad that this holistic view has now broadened a bit, so that all stakeholders know very well that they must not think of their special issue alone. Thank you.
And finally, Augustine, what are your concluding thoughts today?
But the concluding thoughts I don't know, but I can tell you my thoughts. I think what I liked about today's discussion that is also that costs are important. I mean, we owe it to our citizens to make sure that the net zero objective can be reached, but we also owe it that it is done in the most cost-efficient way. So we are speaking already about let's say the distributional effect and the problems which are related to the fact that member states have different starting positions. Of course, that is very important. In the context of the various projections which we as Commission have been trying to do, we have been looking also at the costs. One conclusion of that is the costs are, in terms of investments, are rather staggering. But I think it's also it also needs to be emphasized that in the end the cost to consumers are I don't want to put a figure on it because I don't know it by heart, but are surprisingly modest. That is not only because the worst case scenarios are being avoided, which have been already emphasized before, but also because many of the costs actually relate to making sure that the technologies which we need by 2050 in order to have a decarbonized energy system need scaling up, and if scaling up, costs come down very fast. This so making the right choices and making sure that we can go down these cost curves very soon is important. Another important thing when it comes to cost efficiency, I think, is to emphasize the role of the continued role of utilities and the role of markets in this transition. We should try to avoid, at least as my honest opinion, that we put ourselves in the shoes of end users when we make the choices of decarbonization. Some speakers before have emphasized the fact that we should, for instance, use hydrogen in specific niches, to which I fully agree. But in the end, it's the end user the people who invest in end user applications which are best placed to make this kind of decision. So maybe we should retranslate our task in making sure that on the moment consumers take decarbonization decisions, they can do this in a context which is more best apt to make sure that they take the best decisions. That has to do with markets and prices. It has to do with tax reforms and a number of elements that they both see the right price signals and cost signals and are incentivized to actually take these kind of decisions. That is what I wanted to add to the debate as a last comment.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing their opinions with us today. I think we have a diversity of different opinions here, and definitely the conversation is going to continue into next year as we see all of this implementing legislation for the 2030 and 2050 targets see the light of day. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you for you at home for following along and asking some great questions. And we will see you next time for the next Euractiv debate. Take care.